The gleaming terminal of John F. Kennedy International Airport buzzed with its usual morning energy as 12-year-old Marcus Thompson wheeled his small silver suitcase toward Gate B7. His designer sneakers barely made a sound on the polished floor, and his pressed blue button-down shirt and khaki pants reflected the way his parents had raised him: polished, proper, and prepared for anything. Marcus wasn't like most kids his age when it came to flying. While others might be nervous or excited, he moved through the airport with the confidence of a seasoned traveler. After his parents' divorce 2 years ago, these solo flights between New York and Los Angeles had become as routine as taking the school bus. As he approached the priority boarding line, Marcus pulled out his first-class ticket and passport with practiced ease. The gate agent smiled warmly, checking his unaccompanied minor paperwork with a quick nod. "Have a great flight, Mr. Thompson," she said, handing back his documents. That's when senior flight attendant Patricia Walsh first noticed him. She was standing near the aircraft door, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform crisp and perfect after 23 years of service. Her eyes narrowed slightly as Marcus approached, and her welcoming smile faltered for just a moment. So quick that most people would have missed it, but Marcus had seen that look before. "Excuse me, young man," Patricia called out, her voice carrying that sugary sweet tone adults often used when they were about to cause trouble. "I think you might be in the wrong line. General boarding is through the other door." Marcus held up his first-class boarding pass. "No, ma'am. I'm in seat 2A, please," he replied politely, just as his father had taught him to handle such situations. Patricia's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched higher. She took his boarding pass, studying it as if it might be counterfeit. A line was forming behind Marcus now, and several passengers were starting to watch the interaction with interest. "And you're traveling alone?" she questioned, her tone making it clear she found this unusual. "Where are your parents?" A younger flight attendant, Jenny Chen, glanced over at the commotion. She quickly checked her tablet and stepped forward. "Everything's in order, Patricia. Mr. Thompson is on our unaccompanied minor list for first class." Patricia pressed her lips together, reluctantly stepping aside. As Marcus walked past her into the plane's cabin, he could feel her eyes following him, watching his every move. He found his seat easily, a plush leather chair by the window, and placed his backpack carefully in the overhead bin. As other passengers boarded, Marcus noticed how Patricia kept finding reasons to walk past his seat, each time glancing at him as if he were a puzzle she couldn't solve. When she helped an elderly woman store her bag in the bin above Marcus's seat, he heard her mutter something about standards these days. Marcus pulled out his book, a worn copy of The Alchemist his father had given him, and tried to lose himself in the pages, but he could feel the weight of Patricia's suspicious glances, the way she hovered nearby, the subtle way she was making it clear she thought he didn't belong. Little did Patricia Walsh know that this routine flight from New York to Los Angeles was about to become the biggest mistake of her career. As the plane's engines roared to life and the flight crew prepared for departure, no one, least of all Patricia, could have guessed that the quiet boy in seat 2A would soon turn her world upside down. The first hour of the flight passed quietly as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet above the clouds. Marcus had just finished another chapter of his book when the smell of warm food began wafting through the cabin. His stomach growled softly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since early morning. Patricia Walsh pushed the silver service cart down the aisle of first class, her plastic smile firmly in place as she served each passenger. "Good morning, sir. Would you like the chicken or beef today?" she asked the businessman across from Marcus, her voice warm and professional. The contrast in how she treated different passengers wasn't lost on anyone watching. When she reached Marcus's row, her smile vanished like sun behind storm clouds. "Meal?" she asked curtly, barely looking at him. "Yes, please," Marcus replied politely. "I should have a vegetarian meal pre-ordered." He straightened up in his seat, trying to appear as mature as possible. It wasn't his first time dealing with people like Patricia, and his father had always taught him that dignity was the best response to prejudice. Patricia's lips twisted into a small sneer. "I don't see any special meal requests for this seat," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You'll have to choose between the regular options like everyone else." An elderly woman across the aisle looked up from her magazine, frowning at Patricia's tone. Marcus felt his cheeks grow warm, but he kept his voice steady. "Could you please check again? My father made the arrangement last week." "Listen, young man," Patricia's voice took on that condescending tone adults sometimes use when they think they've caught a child in a lie. "I've been doing this job for longer than you've been alive. I know how to read a meal request list." Just then, Jenny Chen, the younger flight attendant, approached with a tablet in hand. "Actually, Patricia," she said quietly, "I can see the vegetarian meal request right here for seat 2A. It was confirmed twice." She pulled a special meal tray from the lower compartment of the cart. Patricia's face flushed red. Several passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. A man in a business suit 2 rows ahead had even taken out his phone, holding it low but clearly recording the interaction. "Well," Patricia snapped, snatching the tray from Jenny's hands, "you should have mentioned this special request during boarding." She practically dropped the tray onto Marcus's table, causing some of the water in his glass to splash. Marcus carefully wiped up the spilled water with his napkin, maintaining his composure even as Patricia stormed off with the cart. Jenny gave him an apologetic smile before following her colleague. "Are you okay, dear?" the elderly woman across the aisle asked Marcus. Her kind eyes reminded him of his grandmother's. "Yes, Mom, thank you," Marcus replied with a small smile. "I'm used to it." The fact that a 12-year-old boy had to be used to such treatment made several nearby passengers exchange concerned glances. A couple in the row behind Marcus began whispering to each other, occasionally glancing toward the galley where Patricia had disappeared. For the next 30 minutes, Patricia made a show of checking on every other passenger in first class, pointedly ignoring Marcus's existence. When she did have to walk past his seat, her body language was tense, as if she was just waiting for him to do something wrong. Marcus could feel the tension building in the cabin, like pressure before a thunderstorm. He tried to focus on his book again, but the words seemed to blur together. His father had always told him that sometimes people's true colors show when they think they have power over others. Right now, Patricia Walsh was showing her colors to everyone on this flight, and she had no idea that her actions were about to have consequences far beyond anything she could imagine. The real storm, however, was yet to come. 3 hours into the flight, Marcus felt his eyelids growing heavy. He had just finished another chapter of his book when he remembered his iPad was still in his backpack in the overhead bin. Getting up slowly, he checked to make sure the seatbelt sign was off before standing. The businessman sitting next to him had fallen asleep, his soft snores barely audible over the plane's engines. Marcus carefully stepped into the aisle, conscious not to disturb anyone. He was tall for his age, but still had to stretch to reach the overhead compartment. Just as his fingers touched the latch of the bin, Patricia Walsh's voice cut through the cabin like a knife. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, rushing down the aisle with surprising speed for someone in heels. Marcus turned, startled by her sudden appearance. "I'm just getting my backpack, ma'am. My iPad is." "Step away from that bin immediately." Patricia's voice rose sharply, causing several passengers to jolt awake. "How dare you try to go through other people's belongings?" "But it's my—" Marcus began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Marcus reached again for his backpack, Patricia's hand shot out like a striking snake. The sharp crack of her palm against his hand echoed through the quiet cabin, followed by a collective gasp from nearby passengers. Marcus stumbled backward, more from shock than pain, cradling his stinging hand against his chest. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the engines and the horrified murmurs of passengers. "Oh my God!" The elderly woman who had been kind to Marcus earlier stood up, her face pale with anger. Did everyone just see that? She hit a child. The cabin erupted into chaos. Phones appeared from every direction, recording the aftermath. The businessman who had been sleeping was now wide awake, standing protectively near Marcus. "That's assault," he said firmly, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "I'm a witness, and I've got it on video." Patricia's face, which had been red with anger, suddenly drained of color as she realized what she'd done. I thought he was stealing," she stammered, but her words were drowned out by the outrage of the passengers. Jenny Chen rushed forward, positioning herself between Marcus and Patricia. "Marcus, are you okay?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. She turned to Patricia, her professional demeanor barely masking her shock. "Patricia, you need to return to the galley immediately." The lead flight attendant, a tall man named David, appeared quickly. "What's happening here?" he asked, though the numerous phones pointed in their direction told him plenty. "She slapped my hand," Marcus said quietly, his composure remarkable for someone his age. "I was just trying to get my iPad from my backpack." His voice didn't waver, but those closest could see tears gathering in the corners of his eyes, not from pain, but from the humiliation of being treated this way in front of so many people. David's face hardened as he listened to multiple passengers recount what had happened. He turned to Patricia, his voice low but firm. "Go to the back galley now. I need to radio the captain." As Patricia retreated, looking significantly less confident than she had moments ago, Marcus finally managed to get his backpack down. The elderly woman helped him check his hand, which was red but not seriously injured. "You're being very brave, young man," she said softly. "Does this sort of thing happen to you often?" Marcus shook his head, pulling out his phone. "No, ma'am, and it won't happen again." His fingers moved swiftly over the screen as he typed out a message. "My father always says that when people show you who they are, believe them the first time." The calm certainty in his voice made several passengers exchange glances. There was something about the way he said "father" that suggested Patricia Walsh's troubles were only beginning. Little did she know, as she hid in the back galley awaiting instructions from the captain, that her career wasn't just in jeopardy. It was about to become a cautionary tale that would change airline policy forever. The atmosphere in the plane had shifted dramatically since the incident. What had started as a routine cross-country flight now felt like a courtroom, with passengers serving as both witnesses and jury. Videos of Patricia slapping Marcus's hand had already been shared among passengers through airdrop, spreading from phone to phone like wildfire. Captain James Reynolds's voice crackled over the intercom, unusually serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been made aware of an incident in first class. I want to assure you that we're taking this matter extremely seriously. We've notified ground authorities who will meet us upon landing. Please remain calm and seated." In the back galley, Patricia sat on the jump seat, her hands trembling as she filled out an incident report. Her perfectly maintained uniform suddenly felt too tight, too restrictive. 23 years of service, and it had all come down to one terrible moment of lost control. Meanwhile, Marcus was handling the situation with remarkable poise. He had sent just one text message, then switched his phone to airplane mode again, following proper flight protocols. The message was simple. "Dad, there's been an incident on flight AA 2547. I'm okay, but you should meet the plane. Gate C4, LAX, 2:30 p.m. Jenny Chen brought him an ice pack wrapped in a soft cloth. "I'm so sorry this happened," she whispered, genuine concern in her eyes. "We're not all like her, you know." The businessman next to Marcus, who had introduced himself as Richard Torres, was now in full lawyer mode. "I've got the whole thing on video," he assured Marcus. "Would you like me to send it to your father's email?" "Yes, please," Marcus replied softly. "He'll want to see it." The elderly woman across the aisle, Mrs. Robinson, hadn't returned to her seat since the incident. She sat in the empty chair next to Marcus, sharing stories about her own grandchildren and occasionally shooting fierce glares toward the back galley where Patricia was hidden. David, the lead flight attendant, made frequent checks on Marcus while coordinating with the cockpit. Each time he passed, his professionalism couldn't quite mask his embarrassment at his colleagues' behavior. "We're about an hour from Los Angeles," he informed Marcus. "Aviation police will meet us at the gate. Will someone be meeting you?" Marcus nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, my father will be there." The way he said it caught David's attention. There was something in the boy's quiet confidence that made him pause. He'd been flying long enough to recognize when there was more to a story than met the eye. Near the back of first class, a woman who'd identified herself as a social media influencer was live-streaming a whispered commentary about the events. "This is exactly what's wrong with America right now," she was saying into her phone. A child, just trying to get his iPad. And this woman's first instinct was to assume he was stealing. As the plane began its initial descent into Los Angeles, the tension only grew. Patricia had been instructed to remain in the back galley, but everyone could hear her occasional sobs. Her career was flashing before her eyes, and she knew it. Marcus sat quietly, reading his book, though anyone watching closely might have noticed he hadn't turned a page in the last 20 minutes. His hand had stopped stinging, but the memory of the incident played on repeat in his mind. His father had always taught him about dignity in the face of prejudice, about letting actions speak louder than words. Today, those lessons would prove more valuable than ever. The plane banked left, beginning its final approach to LAX. Through the window, Marcus could see the sprawling city below. Knowing somewhere down there, his father was already in motion. Patricia Walsh thought she'd just had a momentary lapse in judgment with an unaccompanied minor. She had no idea she'd just slapped the hand of Michael Thompson's son, the boy whose father owned not just this airline, but 3 others. As the landing gear descended with a heavy thud, Marcus fastened his seatbelt and smiled. Sometimes, he thought, the best lessons in life come from unexpected teachers. The plane touched down at LAX right on schedule, its wheels hitting the runway with a gentle bump. But unlike usual flights where passengers would immediately reach for their phones, everyone in first class remained perfectly still, watching and waiting. They all knew something big was about to happen. Through the windows, they could see 3 airport police vehicles with flashing lights waiting by gate C4. As the plane taxied to its position, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up beside them. Even from a distance, the airline's executive logo was visible on its side. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Please remain seated until we've parked at the gate. We have a situation that needs to be handled by the authorities first." Patricia Walsh stood in the back galley, her face ashen. Jenny had never seen her proud colleague look so small. Gone was the arrogant flight attendant who'd ruled the cabin with an iron fist. In her place stood a trembling woman who jumped at every sound. As soon as the seatbelt sign dinged off, the main cabin door opened. 2 aviation police officers entered first, followed by a tall, distinguished-looking black man in an impeccably tailored suit. Michael Thompson's presence filled the cabin instantly. His eyes scanned the first-class section until they landed on Marcus. "Dad," Marcus called out, his composure finally cracking a little as he stood up. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Michael Thompson made his way to his son. He carefully examined Marcus's hand, his jaw tightening at the sight of the lingering red mark. "Mr. Thompson," David, the lead flight attendant, approached nervously. "I want to personally apologize." Michael raised a hand, silencing him. "You've done your job well today, David. Jenny too. This isn't about you." His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority that came from owning 4 major airlines. When Patricia was brought forward by the second officer, she looked like she might faint. Recognition dawned on her face as she saw Michael Thompson. His picture hung in every crew room after all. She'd walked past it thousands of times, never imagining she'd meet him like this. Mr. Thompson," she stammered. "I had no idea. I never meant to." "That's precisely the problem, Ms. Walsh." Michael's voice cut through her excuses like a knife through butter. "You had no idea. You saw a young black boy in first class and made assumptions. Would you like to know what my son was doing when you slapped his hand? Patricia's silence was deafening. He was reaching for the iPad I gave him for his straight A's last semester. The iPad that was in his own backpack, in his assigned bin, above his legitimate first-class seat. Each word was measured, precise. The other passengers had begun filming again. The social media influencer was live-streaming the entire confrontation, her followers growing by the thousands. "Dad," Marcus spoke softly, touching his father's arm. "Remember what you always say about grace under pressure." Michael's expression softened as he looked at his son. Even in this moment, Marcus was thinking about doing the right thing. Mrs. Robinson, still hovering protectively nearby, wiped a tear from her eye. "You're right, son." Michael turned back to Patricia. "Ms. Walsh, you'll be escorted off the plane by these officers. Your employment is, of course, terminated, effective immediately. But more importantly, you'll be required to attend our new corporate sensitivity training program as its first case study." Patricia's legs nearly gave out. Being fired was one thing, but becoming a cautionary tale in corporate training. Her humiliation would be complete. "Sir," Richard Torres stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I have video evidence of the entire incident." "Thank you," Michael nodded. "But this isn't about punishment. This is about change." He looked around the cabin at all the watching faces. "This ends today, not just on my airlines, but on every airline." As Patricia was led away by the officers, Marcus gathered his belongings. Just before leaving, he turned to Jenny and David. "Thank you for showing me that there are good people everywhere." The passengers burst into spontaneous applause as Marcus and his father left the plane. As they walked through the terminal, Michael's arm around his son's shoulders, hundreds of phones captured the moment. By sunset, their story would be trending nationwide. But the real changes were just beginning. The incident on Flight AA 2547 didn't fade away like most viral stories do. Instead, it became the spark that lit a fire of change across the entire airline industry. 1 week after the incident, Michael Thompson sat in his expansive office on the top floor of Thompson Airlines headquarters, watching the video for what felt like the 100th time. The clip of Patricia slapping Marcus's hand had racked up over 50 million views across social media platforms. #JusticeForMarcus was still trending, and major news networks had been running the story nonstop. But Michael wasn't interested in the publicity. He was focused on making real change. "Dad," Marcus said, entering the office after his school day, "have you seen the comments on the latest news story? People are sharing their own experiences. It's not just about me anymore." Michael smiled proudly at his son. The past week had been intense, with reporters camping outside their house and interview requests flooding in. But Marcus had handled it all with the same quiet dignity he'd shown on the plane. "That's exactly why we're doing this, son," Michael replied, turning his computer screen to show Marcus the document he'd been working on. The title read, "Thompson Airlines Comprehensive Anti-Bias Training Program." Just then, Michael's assistant buzzed in. "Sir, Ms. Walsh is here for her scheduled meeting." Patricia Walsh looked very different from the proud flight attendant she'd been a week ago. Gone was her crisp uniform, replaced by a simple business suit. Her hands clutched her purse tightly as she entered the office, clearly nervous about facing Michael and Marcus again. "Please, sit down." Michael gestured to a chair. "We have something important to discuss." Patricia perched on the edge of the seat, looking like she might bolt at any moment. "Mr. Thompson, I've had a lot of time to think this past week. What I did was inexcusable." "You're right, it was," Michael agreed. "But do you understand why you did it?" Tears welled up in Patricia's eyes. "I've been examining my behavior, my assumptions. 23 years of flying. And I never once questioned my own biases. I just assumed that a young black boy couldn't belong in first class." Marcus finished her sentence quietly. Patricia nodded, ashamed. "I've read every comment on those viral videos. So many people sharing similar stories. I had no idea how many lives I might have affected over the years with my prejudices. Michael leaned forward. That's why we're not just firing you, Ms. Walsh. We're going to make you part of the solution. He explained his new initiative, a mandatory training program for all airline staff, focusing on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and proper treatment of all passengers. Patricia would share her story as part of the training, helping others learn from her mistakes. You mean you want me to help? Patricia asked, bewildered. Sometimes, Marcus chimed in, the best teachers are the ones who learn their lessons the hard way. The program would be implemented across all Thompson Airlines first, then shared with other carriers. Major airlines were already calling, wanting to be part of the change. As Patricia left the office that day, she passed Jenny Chen in the hallway, now promoted to lead trainer for the new program. The two women exchanged glances, one career ending as another began to soar. Later that evening, as Michael drove Marcus home, they passed a group of protesters outside the airline's headquarters. But these weren't angry protesters. They were holding signs thanking Thompson Airlines for taking a stand. Dad, Marcus said, watching the supporters through the car window, do you think this will really change things? Michael squeezed his son's shoulder. Change doesn't happen overnight, son, but it has to start somewhere. And sometimes, it starts with one brave boy who kept his dignity when others lost theirs. The news that evening would announce Thompson Airlines' new training initiative, but the real story was about how a moment of prejudice had been transformed into an opportunity for lasting change. Patricia Walsh's career as a flight attendant was over, but her journey of redemption was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the incident that changed the airline industry forever. The grand ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel was packed with airline executives, civil rights leaders, and media personalities. The occasion, the first annual Thompson Airlines Diversity and Inclusion Summit. Marcus Thompson stood at the podium, looking much taller than he had that day on the plane. At 13 now, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that matched his father's, he faced the audience with the same quiet confidence he'd shown during the incident. 6 months ago, I was just a kid trying to get his iPad. Marcus began, drawing a gentle laugh from the crowd. Today, I'm standing here because that moment became something bigger than me. In the front row, Mrs. Robinson, the elderly passenger who had stood up for him, sat beaming. She had become like a grandmother to Marcus, and her viral video interview about that day had touched millions. Next to her sat Richard Torres, the lawyer whose video evidence had helped spark the movement. Our statistics speak for themselves, Marcus continued, as the screen behind him displayed the numbers. Over 50,000 airline staff trained across the country. Passenger complaints about discrimination down by 73%. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The camera panned to show Patricia Walsh, sitting quietly in the middle of the audience. She looked different now, humbler, but somehow more at peace. In the past 6 months, she had shared her story with thousands of airline employees, turning her mistake into a powerful lesson about unconscious bias. Many of you have asked why my father and I chose not to sue, why we didn't demand more severe punishment, Marcus said, his voice strong and clear. The answer is simple. Real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from understanding. Jenny Chen, now the head of diversity training at Thompson Airlines, wiped a tear from her eye. Her new program had become the gold standard in the industry, with other airlines rushing to adopt it. Michael Thompson stepped up to join his son at the podium. When I started this airline, he said, I wanted to build something my son could be proud of. Instead, he taught me how to make it better. The audience stood as Marcus revealed the company's latest initiative, a scholarship program for underprivileged youth interested in aviation careers. The first recipient, the grandson of a flight attendant who had been fired 30 years ago for standing up against discrimination. Sometimes, Marcus concluded, the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for the best changes. After the ceremony, as guests mingled during the reception, Patricia approached Marcus and Michael. She had just finished her 1000th training session the day before. "I never thought I'd say this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But that day was the best mistake I ever made. It forced me to face things about myself I'd never wanted to see." Marcus smiled and did something unexpected. He gave her a hug. The photographer captured the moment, and by morning, it would be on the front page of newspapers nationwide. The slap that changed aviation. Later that night, as Michael drove them home, Marcus stared out at the city lights of Los Angeles. "Dad," he said thoughtfully, "remember how you always told me that one person can change the world?" "Yes, son. I think it takes more than one. It takes the person who made the mistake, the people who stood up against it, and the people willing to learn from it." Michael glanced proudly at his son. "When did you get so wise?" "Probably around the time I learned that sometimes the worst days become the most important ones." As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus's phone buzzed with a notification. Another airline had just announced they were adopting the Thompson training program. Change was spreading, one flight at a time. That night, as Marcus got ready for bed, he looked at the framed photo on his wall, a picture of him and his father at the airline's headquarters. Below it hung a small frame containing his old first-class ticket from Flight AA 2547, a reminder that even the darkest clouds can have silver linings. The incident that began with a slap had evolved into a movement, and Marcus Thompson, the boy who kept his dignity at 35,000 feet, had helped change not just an industry, but the way people thought about prejudice and redemption.